This is the Biz News Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
Before we get into this Biz News interview, we're asking for your subscription and for your feedback on this and all of our Biz News interviews that you'd like. Just scroll down and click on the subscribe button or leave your comments. Thanks. It's not just Americans. It seems everyone is arguing more. Ken Cloke should know. For decades, he's been a mediator and arbitrator, helping settle disputes and researching causes and solutions to impasses of all kinds and sizes. He joins us in this Biz News interview podcast with ideas you can apply immediately to help solve disputes of pretty much all sizes. Kenneth, you have been in the midst of arguments and disputes and conflicts forever, it seems, for decades and decades, and not because you're a nosy neighbor or anything like that, but because people wanted you to be in the middle of it as a mediator. But do you notice anything different in the vexatiousness of Americans post-COVID versus pre-COVID or even during COVID?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that it isn't entirely connected with COVID, but there is definitely an increase in intolerance, a kind of lower threshold for empathy, less interest in hearing who the other person actually is and what's important to them. But a great deal of this comes, I think, from a variety of different stresses and pressures that are creating a fear in people of illness, of loss, of change that they aren't entirely prepared for. And conflict is simply a way of figuring out what it is that people are upset about, what they're worried about. And it's also a way of understanding the cracks in a system. So my definition of conflict is that it is the sound made by the cracks in a system.
It sounds like the sound of an earthquake, a major one.
Yes, and an earthquake is a good example of conflict.
How do you get to people to get to a commonality, a solution, when you have these outside forces?
Well, it turns out that there are a series of methods that work rather well. Number one, describe the problem as an it rather than as a you. So that instead of thinking of the problem as being the other person, it may be the behavior of the other person. And it's much more difficult to change someone than it is to change their behavior. Second, focus on the future rather than the past, because every conflict concerns something that took place in the past. And we can argue forever about who did what to who and whose fault it is. And none of that helps us solve the problem. A third is to shift our focus from looking at people's positions, which is what they want, to focusing on their interests, which are the reasons why they want them. So we ask questions, for example, like, why is that so important to you? Why does that matter to you? What does that mean to you? What would you like to see happen? Questions like that people get into fewer conflicts over. A fourth thing that we do is we ask people to tell stories, not just about what happened, but about who they are. And the purpose of those stories is to increase the level of empathy that is possible between people. And when we understand the other person as somehow similar to us, we're much less inclined to get into conflicts.
Some people would say people seem to be becoming almost devoid of empathy. Have you seen that in your work?
I think there's been a decline in empathy and a kind of some people are calling a kind of desensitization um, of compassion, of caring. And some of this comes from the fact that when we live in a large group of people, it's very difficult for us to connect individually to each of those individuals. It's a rather harsh statement, but one of the statements that is attributed to Stalin is that a single death is a catastrophe, but a million deaths is a statistic.
That's a rather grim statement,
It is.
to say the least.
Yeah, but I think that what has happened because of COVID is that the ordinary contacts that take place between people that build empathy and compassion between them have now largely disappeared. So you and I are now talking by Zoom as opposed to in person. And if we were face to face, we might have a little bit more understanding of each other, trigger a little bit more caring.
You could have some of our really bad newsroom coffee.
I'm all for it.
So indeed, and we've noticed that, oddly enough, in something as ordinary as return to Sunday services in person in church, that people were watching on Zoom or YouTube, but they seem to be much happier being able to talk with each other as they sit down in the pews. This is something that you have seen as well in dispute resolution?
Yes, and I think that it points to a kind of missing quality, and I think that it's nice that you mentioned church, because one word for this quality is energy. That is the perception of the energy of the other, which some people I think can think of as spirit, which is a kind of life energy that flows inside of us, but also between us and around us. And so if we ask the question, where do conflicts occur? They occur in those three locations. They occur inside of us, between us, and around us. And so conflict resolution is really about a different set of procedures that allow us to touch conflicts in those locations and calm them, begin gradually to dismantle them. So yes, personal contact, personal interaction is something that asks people to show up at a level that they don't ordinarily have to show up at. They are more 100% present when they are actually physically present than when they are removed or see each other long distance. So, and yes, there is a kind of pleasure of seeing each other in close proximity.
Any fireman, if you were to talk to him or her, would say they really don't like fighting the fires. They'd much rather the fire had never occurred. When it comes to conflicts, I presume you'd much rather not get that phone call. So how do people go about avoiding this, solving it at a level that is lower than where you are?
Wonderful question. And there are several answers to it. Here's my first. Every mountain was a molehill once. And so if we can reach it when it's still a molehill, we can prevent it from becoming the mountain that leads to the phone call. So what we are looking for are not just ways of calming conflicts, but preventing them from occurring in the first place. And in order to do this, we have to look at systems, family systems, organizational systems, even social systems. Here's an example of a system that creates conflict. A 2-year-old and a coffee table with expensive things on it that the parents care about. That is a prescription for conflict. and the parents are going to yell and the child is going to cry and the stuff is going to get broken. But it's not the coffee table's fault that it's low to the ground, or the thing's fault that they're breakable, or the parents' fault that they care about them, or the 2-year-old's fault that they're curious. So the preventative method is simply take the expensive stuff and put it on the mantle. And you have just stopped that conflict from taking place. At a deeper level, what we have to see is something that is much more profound. And that is that every conflict that we experience in our lives takes place at a crossroads that is defined on the one hand by a problem we are now required to solve, and on the other hand by the fact that we do not yet have the skills we need in order to solve it. And we know this because nobody our age gets into conflicts with the kids on the playground over who gets to play with the toys. Why? Because we figured out how to solve that problem. We don't get into conflicts with our parents over curfew because we are now grown up. So it isn't that we actually solved the problems or even prevented them. We outgrew them. And how did we do that? By acquiring a set of skills that allow us to address the problem at an early stage and say, oh, you want the toy or the plaything on the playground? Let's play together and share it, or whatever it may happen to be. And I think this is true of every conflict that we face. And if that is true, what it means is that conflicts are incredibly important as a matter of life choice, because what they signal is the fact that we don't yet have the skills we need and that the conflict is important. So here's another idea. There are no 2-year-olds who have conflicts over romantic love. Why? They're not ready yet. It's not a problem for them. And so we don't get conflicts that aren't a problem for us. And we don't get problems because we haven't yet approached them. And we don't get conflicts over problems that we've already figured out how to resolve. Everything else is on the table. And what it points us to is the role of skill in being able to manage our conflicts. And that's one of the areas that I'm very concerned about, is how do we develop the skills as a society to work with each other, to be kind and caring towards one another, to be in relationships with one another that are useful and enjoyable, and not be silent about the things that matter, but understand what the skills are in being able to communicate what matters to us to the people around us.
Let me move this up to the next floor, and that is self-government. There seems to be, in this country, that people on one side cannot talk to the other without thinking about loading their gun. So how do you resolve, or are you even personally involved in that? And even if not, how would you suggest we move to some sort of level in this country where we can argue civilly and reach common solutions?
Excellent question. And yes, I am involved personally, and I've written 3 books actually on this topic, and a recent article on the war in Ukraine, looking at this topic as well. And I think that the answer in a word is dialogue. But I'd like to expand on that answer and say something a little different. What we are presented with in virtually every political conflict is framed as a digital problem. That is either or, yes or no, up or down, for or against, this candidate or that candidate, this party or that party. But the difficulty is, if you are facing a complex problem, and the problems we are now facing are complex, then we have to have a method of solving the problem that is at least as complex as the problem. And what that means is we have to have dialogues with one another. And in those dialogues, we have to look at the problem as complex. That is, not just either or. I did some work with a political organization that was working with candidates in one of the presidential elections, and multiple candidates, and they were trying to bring people together to talk about the candidates that they liked. But every time they got them together, they would get into huge arguments with one another, and no one would listen. And the problem was, as soon as you mentioned the name of your candidate, all listening stopped. It was over. So here are a couple of questions that allow you to get beyond that. Question one, without mentioning the name of your candidate, what values do you believe your candidate stands for? What are the things that you appreciate about your candidate, but without identifying who the candidate is? And question two, how can we use those values and those things that you appreciate to improve the conversation we are having right now? Question two, or question three, I guess. What life experiences have you had that have led you to feel so deeply about this issue? And now what we get isn't a speech or a diatribe or a monologue. What we get is a story. And what dialogue is fundamentally is the coming together of people who don't agree with each other in a way that allows them to speak to each other. And I have done these dialogues between Israelis and Palestinians, Ukrainians and Russians, between Greek citizens and immigrants, between all kinds of people who hate each other. And the outcomes are extraordinary, because when people sit down together and actually listen and talk to one another and tell the stories about what has happened to them, they are able actually to get along. So one of the problems is that the system, the political system itself, is set up in a way that only allows us to express ourselves in a digital way with the yes or no or for or against. And a second is that the process of doing it is adversarial and pits us against one another. So the outcome of any election is that no matter who you voted for, half the country hates them. And that's no way to solve problems. We can't deal with the issues we face addressing them that way.
Kenneth, how do we solve that? Can you give us one or two things our viewers and listeners could take back and put into place today?
Yes, I wrote a short little piece which is called 50 Questions to Ask in Political Arguments. And it's got quite a number of these ideas in it. I can give you a couple of these. And some of them are some of the ones that I've mentioned before, but there are others in addition to that. Here are some. Where do your beliefs come from? Family, faith, culture, work? What do you think your beliefs might be if you'd been born into a different family, a different religion, race, or gender, or class, or time? What's at the heart of this for you as an individual? Do you see any gray areas in what we're talking about, or things that are difficult to figure out or define? Would you be willing to talk about those? Do you have any mixed feelings about this issue? Any doubts or uncertainties or discomforts? Where's a place, do you believe in this like 100% or 90%? And can you talk about this? What questions do you have for people who are on the other side? What would you be curious to know? What questions would you most like to ask them? And are you willing to answer questions that they ask you? Here are some others. What are some of the key words or phrases that divide us? And what are some of the ones that unite us? What are some hot button words for you? What emotions do you experience, or what do you get triggered by with each of these sets of words? And how do you think we might be able to come up with a different set of words that could solve the problem in a different way? So I did a session, for example, in Puerto Rico between advocates for statehood with the United States and advocates of independence. And the very first rule of the meeting was, you can say anything that you want, but you cannot use the words statehood or independence. And they didn't even know how to begin. So we can then just talk about what do you think the conversation would be like if we decided not to use the words that trigger us? And are you willing to start right now? What values, I mentioned this before, do you believe in, or ideals do you think that both sides share? Are there any ground rules that you'd like before we begin, et cetera, those kinds of things?
Kenneth, I know that you are on a very tight schedule, and we're glad we could get even this amount of time with you. Do you have a website where people can go to get more information?
Sure, it's at www.kencloke.com. That's CLOKE. And there are also a number of YouTube videos and videos on the web that people can find of me teaching how to use these skills. These are all skills that all of us can learn.
One last question, and that is, why aren't you discouraged? Why aren't you standing at the cliff's edge?
Because I see magic every day. The magic of two people who can't talk to each other, the magic of families that haven't spoken to each other in 15 years, all of a sudden having conversations, getting to the bottom of what the problem is and figuring out what they really want and resolving their issues. And I do this every single day. And in mediation, it's about somewhere around 90 to 95% of people who come into conflict resolution resolve their disputes. And the longer you do it, the more successful that process is. So I would just encourage all your listeners to find a mediator, find out about conflict resolution, and don't assume that it can't be resolved, because I figure out every single day ways of resolving it, and you can too.
You've been watching the Biz News Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. Thanks for watching.